Find a seat. You're inside this beautiful sanctuary. I'm Rabbi Jonathan Singer. I'm one of the two senior rabbis here at Congregation Emanu-El. And it's an honor to share this event with people from Shereth Israel and Rabbi Zimmerman Graf, and all of you, and of course to have Daniel Sokach here, which is always a privilege to have you in our community, in our sanctuary, and get your teaching. Now, some of you might have had a little trouble getting here because the president is here for APEC, and he was, it's APEC, right? Not APAC, right? APEC, good, yes. He's here for APEC. And he is having dinner down the street. So there's a little bit of that. I know some people will have chosen to turn around because we also have this on Zoom right now. It's happening on Zoom online as well. It's Parshat Toldot. And I was just reminded about that, and about a certain person saying, mother of Israel, the question, Lama Nichai? Why do I go through this pain? Why am I existing through this? I know a lot of us are in pain right now around this situation in Israel and the Gaza Strip, the whole Middle East. Raise your hand if you are looking at your cell phone even more than ever right now. And it's too much, right? Because we're looking for hope, we're looking for change, we're looking for a way out, and we're in a very, very uncomfortable place as an American Jewish community. So who better than to have Daniel Sokach come and talk to us from the position of NIF that does such important work out in the Jewish world, to come and share with us and answer questions from his perspective and the work that you do about what we should be thinking about why do we keep living, how do we go forward, and how do we build a better future. So it's not Shabbat in here. Will you give him a big hand that we can welcome Daniel Sokach here? Rabbi Graf, why don't you start?
Thank you so much. Is this on? Yeah. So I'm Rabbi Jessica Zimmerman Graf. I'm the senior rabbi at Congregation Shereth Israel, and I'm delighted to be in the other sanctuary with the dome. Very nice to be here with all of you tonight. As we've been having these conversations over the last 5+ weeks now, there's been so much focus on and concern about, understandably, our hostages and our borders and our sort of big picture of this situation, because that's where our heart is. But at the same time, so much is happening inside of Israel and between people in this place of civil society, which is where NIF shines and does incredible work. I just heard in this past week at 2 different lectures about things going on, a court case for a gay couple. The one in the military was killed, and his husband is right now in the midst of this war bringing up this question about survivorship rights. And there are incredible things going on still to build a civil society that shares our values that we really believe in. So even at this moment that all of this is happening, NIF has jumped to the forefront to be able to help with what's going on, and it's an incredible time to think about what will be now and what will be the day after this war is over and we work to build a brand new society. So I want to start off, Daniel, with a question about kind of what NIF has been doing. I mean, you've been on the ground a lot and working with these incredible NGOs that are registered in Israel, but working to create necessary change all over the place. And I want to know how, from within, you've been able to work with smaller groups of people to affect really big change.
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you, both of you rabbis. Another rabbi in the room tonight said it's a hometown crowd, and it feels, I have to say, I've spent 3 of the last 5 awful weeks traveling for work, and it does feel good to be with a hometown crowd. And in no other city did the President of the United States come to pay his respect to all of us the way he did. So Well, first, I feel, I want to just, what you said really resonated with me, and this is just a time of incredible pain. Yeah, I've been the CEO of the New Israel Fund. This month is my 14th anniversary. I've spent my entire life since I was 16 years old devoted to this cause and caring about this place, and there's never been a more challenging and difficult time. And one of the glimmering lights, I don't want to call it a silver lining because I feel like that's too much, but one of the lights in this darkness has been the civil society that you mentioned. And I think even more so than it might first appear, because, well, let me just say, even though it's a hometown crowd and most of us know each other, I will try to tell you when I'm giving an editorial opinion, right? And we may or may not agree, but we can also talk civilly and disagree civilly if you don't like something I'm saying. So what I'm about to say is an editorial opinion. It happens to be an opinion that is backed by 4 out of 5 Israelis in a poll that was released just a couple of days ago. The role of civil society in Israel at this moment, the NIF role, and beyond NIF, I believe is more important than it's ever been before in the history of the state of Israel, because the horror of the attack on October 7th, the abomination of the Hamas attack on Israel, was met with a catastrophic collapse of virtually all the systems of the state of Israel that the government is meant to provide to care for its citizens. We're well aware of the intelligence failure. We're well aware of the military and security failures, but there was also a failure in early response. And again, in Israel today, it's not the top of the line headline for many of us, but for those who are checking their phones often, 4 out of 5 Israelis lay responsibility, in my opinion, correctly, for the state of unpreparedness that Israel found itself in the horrible morning of the 7th of October at the feet of a government that had, to put it mildly, other agendas over the last year since its formation, despite warnings from the defense minister. You must stop this judicial overhaul, despite warnings from the president of the state of Israel. You are dividing the country. The prime minister refused to meet with his army chiefs and intelligence chiefs when they tried to meet with him. And of course, horrifically, we saw what happened. The country was divided, it wasn't ready, and the government's response was, as I said, in the opinion of 4 out of 5 Israelis, a catastrophic failure. Into that breach, and here's the silver lining, stepped civil society. And I'm not the first person to observe this, but if there was a moment where we could feel this unbelievable pride in what has been built in Israel over the last 75 years, it's that, faced with the horror of October 7th, the main protest organization, which is called Achim B'Neshek, Brothers in Arms, they immediately put down their protest signs. They immediately went back to their units or went down to the south to begin to help with relief of the communities that have been affected. In Tel Aviv, there is now a huge warehouse with hundreds and hundreds of volunteers sending material and aid to people in need in the south of the country that is peopled by volunteers, Israelis. No one told them to, no one ordered them to, but when they saw the state wasn't there, they jumped in, and the New Israel Fund did the same thing. NIF went from being the sponsor of the very first of the democracy protests to joining those protest movements and immediately pivoting. And our pivot was in 4 areas. And 3 of them are things that those of you who are NIF people will be familiar with. And one of them is something that is less familiar for New Israel Fund, although there is precedent. Because during the Second Lebanon War, before my time at NIF in 2006, NIF also stepped in to provide what I'll call humanitarian relief. And the humanitarian relief that we have been providing over the last 5 weeks, this is something we're now able to draw down as the mighty federation system is beginning to really pump money into the field and as the government is beginning to respond. But in those early weeks, we provided aid of a sort that we don't usually provide. And there were several aspects of this. The first, let me describe, and maybe we all know this, but I think it's worth reviewing, who exactly was in the front line of the terror attacks. this is a terrible, terrible moment for all of us. As the rabbis have said, it's a moment where we're all sort of feeling this horror and pain. And I think we all would feel it if it happened anywhere in the world. I think that's part of the pain that many of us feel, is that it seems like in lots of places in the world, they forgot pretty quickly what had happened in Israel. Despite the horror of what's happening to innocent people in Gaza, it seems like people don't remember that 1,200 people, that's the new government figure, were slaughtered in this terrorist attack. For the New Israel Fund community, it was particularly proximate. And what I mean by that is there are three main groups of Israelis who live in communities in or near what's called Ofek Aza, the Gaza envelope. And the first of these communities are the ones that many of us have read a lot about. They're kibbutzim. Many of them predate the establishment of the state, and many of them were established by a socialist Zionist labor youth group called Hashomer Hatzair. I see some schmutzniks in the audience here. There they are. Well, these guys were, these people were labor Zionists, deeply patriotic, and so they said, you know, what we can do to serve the state is create a perimeter around the border where Gaza, which was then controlled by Egypt, where Gaza is, so we can be a first line of defense for this, for the state when it emerges or right after it had emerged. But they didn't just do it for patriotic defensive reasons. They also did it because they had a philosophy, a different kind of philosophy than the one predominant, for example, in the government of Israel today. And in the decades following the establishment of these kibbutzim, they became, in one of the most painful and terrible, tragic ironies of the horror of October 7th, they became the deepest blue state in blue state Israel, right? So, you know, there's Tel Aviv and Haifa, but these kibbutzim, they're not, you know, all kibbutzim for the most part are blue state Israel, right? You get the painful metaphor I'm doing here, the awkward metaphor. But the Hashomer Hatzair kibbutzim are particularly, they are very liberal, and they began to be populated by people who cared desperately about improving relations between Arabs and Jews within Israel and with Arabs and Jews in the region, in particular in Gaza. And it was those kibbutzim that took the brunt of the first wave of the attack. And those of you who are NIF supporters got an email from me today. We found out the other day that a very beloved member of our community, a former board member of ours and a dear friend and mentor to me and many others, who we had thought was among the kidnapped to Gaza, a woman called Vivian Silver, who has devoted her life to Arab-Jewish shared society, who in her spare time, she founded an organization with another NIF board member called Amal Al-Sana, a Bedouin woman, called Ajik, an Arab-Jewish women's economic empowerment organization. She founded Women Wage Peace, right, self-explanatory. And in her spare time, she drove children who were allowed out of Gaza to oncology appointments in Israel. That's what she did in her spare time. So Vivian was murdered on October 7th. One of our grantee organizations called Breaking the Silence, which is one of the more controversial, it's a human groups we support, a human rights organization made up of super elite combat veterans who then give testimonies about illegal orders that they were given in the West Bank, right? And you can understand why a lot of Israelis don't want to hear about this. One of their staff members was murdered when he ran out of ammunition after he ran outside to fight the terrorists. One of another grantee organization called Yesh Din, another human rights group, a legal human rights group, the executive director was besieged in her kibbutz for 24 hours with her family. So horrible and very proximate to us. Now, there's no one in Israel, and many of us here who don't have connections to people who have suffered and been traumatized, but the ranks of our grantee organizations have been decimated because of how close they are. And so we have had to provide not only material support for people evacuated from these places, but also trauma support. When it comes to the second community nearby, those are Bedouin villages, Israeli Bedouin citizens, Arab citizens. There's about 90,000 Bedouins who live in what's called unrecognized villages. These are villages that the state of Israel doesn't recognize. Israel, like a lot of countries, it's not unique to Israel, there's a struggle between nomadic peoples and settled populations. The dynamic of Jewish-Arab plays into this in a very profound way in Israel, but the state tells people you can't graze here, you got to move here. The nomads don't want to move there, so they move here. The state says we don't recognize you here, and on it goes. But what that means is the unrecognized Bedouin villages don't have state services. And in addition to water and electricity, they're not on the grid, they don't have bomb shelters. And as we all know, Hamas missiles and Hamas terrorists did not discriminate between Jewish and Arab citizens of the state. And scores of Bedouin Israelis were slaughtered. And hopefully you read some of the stories about Bedouins who drove into the fighting to rescue people and bring them out. So we are working to get them mobile bomb shelters. And I thought this is one of the court cases you were going to mention. We had a tremendous victory 2 weeks ago at the High Court when our organizations went to the High Court, and the High Court of Justice said that region of the Western Negev now is now declared a populated zone. Previously, it had been an unpopulated zone. What's the difference? A populated zone gets coverage from the Iron Dome missile defense. Unpopulated zones did not have any missile defense. So the third group, and then we'll go to your next question, the third group of folks that we've been providing humanitarian aid for are residents of the development towns near Gaza. These are places like Sderot and Ofakim. They're not NIF heartland communities like the kibbutzim and the Bedouin villages. They're peopled by people who were sent there by Ashkenazi elites back in the 40s and 50s. They still burn with resentment about being sent to these places far from Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa. Mostly Mizrahi Jews live here. And they were also evacuated, and after the attacks, people attacked Sderot and Ofakim, and we got a call, our Israeli office got a call from residents of Ofakim who had been bused to Eilat, and when they got there, we're told, nobody told us you were coming. As I said, the government failed in many ways. There's no hotel rooms, there's no shelter, there's no food, there's no medical treatment. A lot of people were injured, traumatized, and somehow someone thought to call the New Israel Fund. And we bought $70,000 of hotel rooms that night, and then we continued over the week. And one of them posted on social media, at times like this, you find out who the real angels are. And in our case, the angels were those traitors of the New Israel Fund, she said tongue-in-cheek.
Well, on the note of the work that the fund does, and you've done a lot of work in civil society between Israeli Arabs and Jews. And some of the stuff I've been reading, Daniel, says that, that the Israeli Arab community has seen itself in support of the state in a way that surprised other people. And I'm wondering if the bridges that have been built through the fund have helped with that. What's your take on the perspective of that community and the work you've done in that community?
Well, certainly there's no person associated with the New Israel Fund, and I'm sure including yourself, who was surprised by that. We were, I think, overjoyed and relieved. But I will also say, in a poll that I read yesterday in the Hebrew press, and I don't know if it was in the English language press yet, 90% of Israeli Jews, this was a poll done by one of our grantees, 90% of Israeli Jews said they feared an outbreak of Arab-Jewish intercommunal violence within Israel. 70% of Arab citizens felt that, which I think is also interesting. A huge majority of both parties, but far fewer Arab citizens. Look, do you all remember what happened in May 2021, the last time Hamas and Israel fought? Intercommunal violence broke out in Israel's mixed Arab-Jewish neighborhoods and cities. In places like Lod and Ramla and in Akko, where Jews and Arabs live cheek to jowl, roving gangs of Jewish and Arab youth clashed. It was the first time since 1948. For me, again, personal editorial, that's always been my biggest nightmare. The horror of the 7th of October, I honestly hadn't imagined. I don't think any of us had. But my biggest fear has always been that Israel will descend into that kind of intercommunal violence. That, the percentage of Arab citizens in Israel in the whole citizenry is 21%. Contrast that with 13% of our country who are Black Americans. So it's a huge population. And as we always say, there is no future for Israel that is not a shared Jewish-Arab future. And so after those riots, even during those riots in 2021, we made big investments into the mixed cities by supporting Arab-Jewish groups that are working for a shared society. And what they did was literally open up communication lines with each other. They went door to door and introduced themselves. They made connections with the municipality, with the police, to say, we have to do everything we can to reduce violence, to keep our young people off the streets, to do joint programs together. And in the 2 years since then, we've continued to invest in these groups. And at the beginning of this conflict, that's the second area where we made a big investment. And so far, there has been no repeat of the violence of 2021.
I mean, I think that is something we have to think about, too, as we look and as we're worried about the situation, that there are these communities that are standing together in different ways and not challenging Israel's future. So I think it's really that investment that you all make and that we've supported in the dialogue between the communities and integration of the communities.
But by the way, you said standing together. That's the name of one of my favorite of these organizations that does just what you described.
And even as there's been terrible, terrible violence that the Arab-Israeli community has suffered and that the government was not addressing. So.
Well, I want to follow up on that because Dr. Ron Robin, who's the president of the University of Haifa, spoke at Shereth Israel last Friday night. And he said two things that just really have stayed. He said a lot of interesting things, but he said two things that have really stayed with me. That the universities across Israel are closed because all these people have been called up. Of course, that seems so obvious to me now, but I didn't realize that higher education had been completely shut down. And he talked from his own perspective from Haifa, one of the great mixed cities, and the University of Haifa, one of the great mixed universities, where there's been real cooperation about the fear of what will happen when people who are going to serve in the army come back and meet up with 50% of the student population that or some percentage of the student population that has not gone and that might have a different opinion or that might be handling things differently. So I'd love to hear from your perspective, kind of how NIF has done this work to create these relationships, but nothing's going to be the same when this war is over. What are the next steps to ensure that civil society grows in the right ways and can be jump-started again, because everything's going to have to start anew in some way?
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge the terrible truth of what you said. We don't know, who was it, Rumsfeld, who talked about known knowns and known unknowns? I mean, that guy was something else, but that's kind of a useful set of phrases, and I think about it a lot. And one of the known unknowns that exist right now in my mind, in our mind, is just what you described, which is, what happens the day after in terms of civil society. And look, on the one hand, I think that part of the answer has to be a continued investment by not just NIF, but lots of civil society actors in repairing what's been shattered, building the bridges, making sure people understand what the rabbi said is understood by Israelis, that Arab citizens of Israel have stood loyally with the country, and talk about a crushing mixed identity, right? To be subjected to, especially from this government, real discrimination. Again, I understand that may make some of us uncomfortable, but Israeli citizens Arab Israeli citizens, although equal in most ways on the books, are often treated unequally, and yet those people have not sort of turned against the state. Never have they turned against the state in big numbers in 75 years. So we have to keep the support for those groups that are intentionally trying to maintain and strengthen those bridges. But there's something else that I think has to happen. And in this sense, and I don't want to go off on a tangent, and maybe we'll talk about it later. We have two daughters at an excellent liberal arts college in Southern California. My wife is here. I said we. And one of the things that they're struggling with is what every single one of your kids or grandkids, or you, if you're on a quarter off from college right now, what every single one of you is struggling with on campus right now, and it's tough and challenging. It's not as bad in some places as we hear. It is as bad in other places as we hear. But one of the things that always strikes me is part of the problem that we've encountered on college campuses is that very well-meaning presidents of universities, my wife went to Vassar, that's an exception, Wellesley's an exception. Some people put out great statements, as they should, but in many places, the kind of thoughts and prayers, and both sides are in pain, as heard by Jewish students on October 7th and 8th, felt like gaslighting, right? They knew that those university presidents understood that the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust had happened. But they couldn't acknowledge that. How are then young people supposed to have the courage to speak out in that climate? And when it comes to Haifa, and the president of the University of Haifa is a good guy, and most of the university presidents are, but I think there's a parallel and a lesson to be drawn, because their authority is important, right? And they need to set the tone, in my opinion, proactively and firmly, that we are all Israelis here, and that what happened in Gaza is not going to be translated back to what happened here. And this is a terribly important task for another reason, because that's not going to happen from the government of the state of Israel today.
Wow. Now, I never thought that from the pulpit of Emanu-El, the head of NIF would be quoting Donald Rumsfeld. But, things happen. So here you are, and you work across so many lines with so many organizations also here in this country, different supporters. So how do you address those of us here who feel abandoned by folks that we perceive to have been our partners, that we stand with for social justice in so many ways? How do we address the kids who are saying, from the river to the sea, let Palestine be free? Like, what do we do? The pain that we're talking about isn't just the pain of what's going on there, but the pain of what's going on here.
Yeah, so I'm sure that's on a lot of people's minds. I'll try to give you a few thoughts, but I want to start by sharing with you an email that I think was one of the most beautiful and powerful things I've seen in the last 4 or 5 awful weeks from a board member, a Palestinian citizen of Israel, an Arab Israeli woman, who sent a message to the rest of us on the board, which I was so moved by, I shared it with our staff in our WhatsApp group. And Nasreen, who is a brilliant political scientist and researcher, and for those reasons, like, she's not a person who's not involved in the tough issues, right? She wrote an email the other day, and she said, I'm thinking of all of you in the US, in the UK, Canada, Britain. She named all of our, affiliates around the world. She said, I'm thinking about you, and I'm so horrified by this shocking rise in anti-Semitism and this, and she cited all those things. And she said, I as a person who has a very complicated identity, I understand what it's like to be blamed for, collective blame for me for something I had nothing to do with. And she said, and I just want you to know I love you and I'm thinking of you, period. There was no, and so we must, that's what she wrote. That's what an Arab Israeli woman in the middle of this crucible, which is I think, very eloquently described, may be more complicated for Arab citizens of Israel than for any of us right now. What she did was have the empathy to proactively reach out to those of us living in physical safety to tell us how heartbroken she was about our challenges. And by the way, that's just like, for me, that's why I love New Israel Fund. So I think, I feel like one of the surprises for me over the last few weeks was, I often say to our team that the New York Times, NPR, New Yorker, that's the virtual living room for the NIF support base, over 40 in this country. For the under 40s, it's TikTok, right? So I can't believe how many times we have been in those papers over the last 5 weeks. And what I also can't believe is how many of those articles have been about what you just described. And one of the first interviews that I gave, the reporter for the New York Times asked me that question. And every place I go around the country, what people say is, thank you for saying what you said, because that's how I felt. And what I said was just essentially this. Those of us who do this work at New Israel Fund do it for 2 reasons. We do it, one, because we're deeply and profoundly connected to that place and the peoples who live in that place. And we've all devoted our careers to working to make a better future, to support them, make a better life and a better future for Israel, for Jewish and Arab citizens of Israel. But the second reason we do it is because we're human rights people. We believe in the sacrosanct nature, the sacredness of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of humanitarian law, of all the things put in place after World War II, largely because of our people's trauma and tragedy, that are meant to be aspirational, but also to protect individuals by saying to the states, if you want to be a civilized nation, you cannot do the following things. And so we have often, as you know, been critical of things that the Israeli government has done. Sometimes that has really pissed people off in the Jewish community and in Israel. And so it was a no-brainer for us on October 7th to describe what happened as it was. Full stop, period. No, that was not the time to talk about the context. And I think there was a deep sense of betrayal. I didn't expect those people, I'm not a kid, it's not my first rodeo, right? I didn't expect those people to sympathize with Israel or suddenly become New Israel Fund supporters. But I did expect them to say any violation of human rights and humanity is something that must be condemned. And that they didn't say it, I think tells us something, which is that they're not human rights people. They're people for different reasons who are in a political game. And when it was Israelis, Jews, but also Arab citizens of Israel who were the victims, that didn't demand from them that kind of response. And I think for a lot of people, there'll be a lot of reevaluating about where people show up in those places. On the other hand, it is a pretty small group, and a lot of the people who do this, like on college campuses, I bet they couldn't pick out Tel Aviv and Ramallah on a map, right? I get the sense that for a lot of kids on college campuses, it's Vogue chic stuff.
65,000 a year plus, they still can't do that.
My kids could pick out Tel Aviv. I don't know about Ramallah.
So I want to go back to October 6th for a minute, if only we could, right? If we could stop time. Shimrit was speaking at Shereth Israel about the democracy movement and IF's perspective on what we might do. How many weeks were we into the protests? I don't know, 40 weeks into the protests. And then the entire world changed. But we need to address those issues in some way at some time. What do we do?
Well, I think that this is such a great question because we all forgot about what the year was that preceded this, right? And it was also, in many ways, one of the most traumatic years in the history of the state of Israel, one of the greatest crises, but one that I will tell you I was far more sanguine about before October 7th, right? There was no guarantee of how that was going to end up, but you had an astonishing, staggering majority of Israelis who were saying absolutely not to the Netanyahu government's plan. As I said earlier, there's still an enormous majority that say Bibi must go. We don't know, though, how much of that has to do with what happened up to October 6th and the mismanagement and incompetence shown by the government. I mean, he is still not saying he has any responsibility for what happened. His army chiefs have, his intelligence chiefs has, but even some of his crazy right-wing ministers have, but he hasn't. And the Israeli people, I think, are disgusted by that. And so I think he's got a big political set of problems. But what was happening before was more of an area where I think we can all find hope, again, in the people of Israel, not in the government of Israel, but in, the last poll before October 6th that I saw showed that Jewish Israelis, up to 80% of them were opposed to the government and its agenda. And that if elections were held today, they would be swept out of office. I also, at the risk of embarrassing her, Shimrit, who you mentioned, our Shimrit, the associate director of our Bay Area region, who many of you know, has actually been one of the leaders of the unacceptable movement. That is the Israelis in America who have organized in solidarity with their brothers and sisters back home. So thank you for that. In fact, I walked into the office after one of my road trips, and as I was looking at the wall, there was a picture of her on the front page of the J. So that was pretty cool. So look, none of that is gone. And even when Netanyahu brought Benny Gantz into the government, and we're probably not going to have the conversation in the weeds about Israeli politics as we have had before, but, Benny Gantz going into the government, people say, why did he do that? He's kind of a center-right guy, but he's kind of got an honest, and because last time he did it, he got shockingly screwed. Netanyahu lied to him like he lies to everybody. I think he went back in because I think he's a patriot. And I think he thought, I have to do this. I think his co-leader of the opposition, who was also a patriot, said, I respect what you're doing. I can't go into the government unless Bibi kicks the ultra-nationalist, ethno-nationalists out. And Netanyahu didn't do that for reasons that probably all of us can surmise, right? Because the math hasn't changed for him. And without that slim majority that he has, he's been indicted on 3 felony counts. And he faces the very real prospect of jail time. So everything stopped on October 6th, but also nothing stopped. Because because those people are still in power, And there have been, the third area of NIF special response has been in civil rights, as people have been dismissed from their jobs or from universities because of evincing sympathy for innocent people in Gaza. We're not talking about people saying, I support Hamas. We're talking about people, one guy who is an ultra-Orthodox Jew from Bnei Brak posted a video of himself saying Kaddish for the children of Israel and the children of Gaza. An ultra-right-wing rapper doxed him, and he had to be evacuated from his house after it was attacked by a mob of angry right-wingers. So the atmosphere in Israel is bleak right now, and there are lots of civil rights violations occurring, and government ministers who are saying the authorities should be able to imprison people who have adversely impacted national morale. What do you think that would look like here? There is, this has not disappeared, this question of the democracy movement, and I don't know, I don't have a great answer for you as to what's going to happen when the dust settles, but I believe that there is going to be a political accounting at some point, and it could well be that in that political accounting, right, if for example this government cannot hold on and a new government is formed, that the question about the attack on democracy will essentially be resolved for the time being, because there is a tiny, tiny minority in Israel that wants these changes and an overwhelming majority that does not want them.
I have one more question, then I'll go out and open up to questions. So a motorcade did go by here, and it does have a president who I think he's 39 years old. Is that right?
He's a young guy.
and so I wonder in this moment, what's your take on how President Biden has been responding to this disaster?
I was looking at those. Okay. My personal opinion, no one has to agree, but we are at Emanu-El in San Francisco. I looked at those gut-wrenching polls about the swing states a couple of weeks ago, and all I could think of was, if Joe Biden were running for election in Israel, he would be the overwhelming winner, because he's the most popular politician in Israel right now. There was a beautiful editorial in one of the Israeli newspapers where he said, Joe Biden is the great Zionist politician of our days. And, Netanyahu didn't even meet with the families of the hostages until after Joe met with them. So the guy, he, whatever you think of him, I think he really feels things deeply and sincerely, and he cares desperately about that place. I think so far, I hesitate to do this, but since you asked, right, I give him a pretty high letter grade for how he's managed this, and I think now we're going to see the tension start, because he did not get sort of confused on the 7th and 8th of October about what had happened. He said it, and at a time when it looked like, and I think probably was, the idea that Hezbollah and others would join in right now, he sent the U.S. Navy to the Eastern Mediterranean, or 2 U.S. carrier strike groups in the Eastern Mediterranean. As one of our former board chairs, who herself was the state prosecutor of the State of Israel, she said to me, all the American presidents, they say the right thing, but Joe Biden sent the Navy, right? So this was not lost on Israelis. And now, I think he is quite correctly calling on Netanyahu and the government to have a humanitarian pause. I think he doesn't use the word ceasefire, because I think the word ceasefire has become sort of absurdly politicized by people on all sides who don't really understand what the term means in geopolitics. But so he says there needs to be a humanitarian ceasefire. You need to get relief into Gaza. You need to negotiate for the hostages. You need to provide relief for the people who are cowering in their apartment blocks there. And he has said again and again, first quietly and now much louder in many ways, it is not okay for you guys to keep telling me that you don't have a plan for what comes next. And we're seeing the first real split, in my opinion, not just about the humanitarian pause, but the Biden administration has put forward the outline of a vision that I happen to think is the only realistic way to move forward, right? Which is that there now needs to be a renewed effort to return to some kind of search for, I'll say, partition. Because if I say two-state solution, our eyes glaze over, because we've been told it's impossible, it's an anachronism. I will say the biggest obstacle to a two-state solution has not been a lack of political imagination. It's been a lack of political will on both sides, right, at different times. So now he has said, for example, what many people in the world and many Israelis have been saying, look, we cannot reoccupy Gaza. Now, there are Israeli government ministers who are saying we should do just that. We should start building settlements there again. The Biden administration says you can't do that. And you ultimately need the Palestinian Authority to run that place. And you're going to need in the interim, because the PA can't ride in on the back of a Merkava tank, right? You're going to, if Israel's successful, you're going to need some kind of international peacekeeping force made up of the Arab League. And that's a non-starter if you don't stop building settlements in the West Bank. So in my opinion, the Biden administration, almost every step of the way, has done this. Again, we may disagree. He's threading a needle, and he's done it so far, I think, pretty brilliantly, at potential political cost to himself here.
Well, I do have to say, it's just such an honor to have you here. And now a chance for you all to ask questions independent of the rabbis. So anybody have a question, I'll come to you. And please do make sure it's a question and not an address, okay?
Rabbi, this is a synagogue. There'll be no people who make an address.
Well, so I agree. Oh, I'm sorry. I agree with your analysis about what Biden is trying to do and the fact that they're becoming increasingly vocal about it. It's inconceivable to me that Netanyahu and his government are going to go along with it. And so how would the United States and whoever else Biden brings along basically force the Israeli government to do what you're recommending? And at the same time, if you look at the history of this, the Palestinian Authority hasn't done such a great job either. Yeah. So how if you were controlling the world, tell us how this would play out.
If I'm controlling the world, I got to think about my priorities right now. There are some other things I'd like to get done. Okay, so look, a couple of, I'll try to be quick because we want to get as many questions as we can. One, the idea that you're right. The Netanyahu administration, it's highly unlikely that they're going to go along with this for the simple reason that they don't want to, right? Like, that's not what they want. It has been many, many decades since a U.S. president successfully applied the kind of pressure that U.S. presidents used to apply to Israel. In all of the instances where U.S. presidents applied that pressure, maybe we could call it tochacha, rabbis, right? Loving rebuke. Israel, when faced with real U.S. pressure, of course, had to give way. Tom Dine, who used to be the CEO for a minute of the Federation here and was the head of AIPAC for many years, once said famously, an American president with a legitimate foreign policy objective in the interest of the American people will always be able to defeat the Israel lobby and the government of Israel in a battle of wills if he or she, he didn't say he or she, but I will, if he or she is persistent. And the last time I can remember that happening was Bush and Baker. Yeah, I was told as a kid, when he was a young man, when he was president, they're anti-Semites. Now I look back and think they kind of knew what they were doing. Remember what they did? They said to Shamir, the right-wing prime minister, they said he was dragging his feet. He didn't want to go to Madrid for the peace process after the Gulf War. And finally, the president said, "Look, here's the deal: we're not signing loan guarantees. Most of our aid to Israel is in like a loan guarantee when you sign for your kid's credit card. And so they get huge credit around the world because we, the parent, are saying we'll cover it if need be." And George Bush said, "We're not going to sign loan guarantees unless you stop building settlements in the West Bank." And Shamir said, "You can go to hell." And in an Israeli election a few months later, Yitzhak Rabin was swept in the biggest landslide in Israeli history. So one, the U.S. can apply real pressure if it wants to Israel. Two, as we say in the law, when I was once a lawyer, arguendo, meaning an entirely different conjecture, right? I don't think that the Biden administration and Tom Friedman, who is, I think, probably correctly seen to be often signaling for the Biden administration, he's been on fire recently, by the way. I don't think they're thinking that it will be a Netanyahu administration necessarily that has to make these changes.
Great. Next question, sorry.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Most of the references that you've made, I think, to Arabs and Palestinians have to do with in Israel itself and Gaza. So my question relates to what is kind of lurking in in my background and things I've read about the West Bank, that there's some potential, or even increasing already, but potential bad things that we should worry about that maybe you could comment on.
Yeah, so that's a great way for me to address the last point, which is that the West Bank, of course, is governed by a combination of Israel and the Palestinian Authority. In Area A, which is where the big Palestinian cities live, the Palestinian Authority has responsibility for most things, but the Israeli army goes in whenever it wants to do what it needs to do. That's why we've seen all these clashes, as you correctly point out, over the last couple of years in places like Jenin, which is in Area A. It's a big Palestinian city. Area B is, Area A, by the way, is like a single-digit percentage of the territory of the West Bank, but it contains the vast majority of actual Palestinians living in the cities, Hebron, Ramallah, Jenin, etc. Area B is an area of shared control. It's a small but not as small area, and 60 some odd percent of the West Bank is called Area C. Area C is where all the settlements are, the Israeli settlements, and it's where the IDF has full control. And there are also hundreds of thousands of Palestinians living in Area C. And there, over the last, just the 5 weeks, over 120 Palestinians, most of them civilians, have been killed, some in clashes with the IDF, but many by settlers. And the authorities in Israel have not held to account settlers. And so a reasonable conjecture, in my opinion, it may upset some of you, is that that is activity that is not being stopped or sanctioned because it is not out of the agenda of the Minister of National Security in charge of security in all over Israel and in the West Bank, and the Finance Minister, who is also a deputy minister in the Defense Department in charge of the West Bank. And those two guys are called Bezalel Smotrich is the finance minister and the deputy defense minister in charge of the civil administration, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, and they are Kahanists, right? They have put, so you talk about putting arsonists in charge of, or the fox in charge of whatever the metaphor is, those are people in charge right now. And so we should be worried because they have an agenda. Again, you may think you may not believe me, but if you don't believe me, go read the coalition agreement between Ben-Gvir and Smotrich's parties and Likud. And they say a goal, aspirational, is annexation of the West Bank. That is a stated goal of this government of Israel. That has never been a stated goal of a government of Israel in the past. And so I think that if we're just going to be honest with ourselves and apply Occam's razor and say, what's the simplest explanation for what's happening there, I think that we do have a lot to worry about in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority in charge of the West Bank it's corrupt, it's creaky and old. They haven't had an election for years, mostly because they're afraid Hamas will succeed. Israel has marginalized them and said we have no partner for peace, but kept them barely alive with enough oxygen to do the sort of work of being security, guarantors in the big cities and collecting the trash and whatever. The only way forward is to do something to rehabilitate and revitalize the Palestinian Authority, I believe, right?
Because to jump in, though, to be fair, it's not like Mahmoud Abbas really has been a partner, claiming that there's no Jewish presence ever on the Temple Mount and that Hitler just, whatever. I mean, is there going to be new leadership there that could actually really be a partner?
Well,
I think that Anwar Sadat showed in the Arab world that a person who calls for real peace gets real compromise from the Israelis.
Well, what we know about Mahmoud Abbas is that there is going to be a new leader sooner or later, and probably sooner. But look, there are plenty of more moderate people in sort of Palestinian politics. And everything you said about Abbas is correct, by the way. And yet he still has always stood for, since 1988, a two-state solution. And, he says terrible inflammatory things, much like the ministers in the current Israeli government say terrible inflammatory things. So that's what's my depressing news to you all, is, in my opinion, is that, of course, forget Hamas, right? But the current leadership of Israel and the current leadership of the Palestinian Authority, they're not going to be the people who bring us to the promised land. The Israelis, because they don't want to, the Palestinian leadership, because it can't, but they're not going to be here forever, and we need to be thinking about the day after.
We do. Next question. I've called on two men, so I have to call on a female.
So is all this just a little bubble about a much bigger issue, which is Iran?
I like the succinct nature of your question. I think that everything is connected, and we don't know to what extent the Iranians say we actually didn't know they were going to do this, and our intelligence and Israeli intelligence say kind of sounds to us like they didn't know. Hezbollah also says we didn't know. Hamas political leadership in Qatar says we didn't know. So it's unclear in the directly proximate sort of causal, like were they part of the planning? Who knows? But Iran has built over decades, an axis of sort of radical, anti-Western, anti-Gulf state Arab, anti-Israel entities. I can't say states because most of them aren't states, but the Assad regime in Syria is state-ish. Hezbollah in Lebanon, there's Hamas, there's the Houthi. No one ever heard of the Houthis until they started firing missiles at Israel and at our warships. But that's a Yemeni radical group. But you're absolutely right in the sense that there is what do they call it in the 19th century? There is a great game, which is what they call the European, in the 19th century, the great game between the empires of France and Russia and Germany and England. So there is a great game going on in the Middle East now, and that's why that's why the Biden administration and the Trump administration have been so keen to try to build and strengthen the Israeli Sunni Gulf state alliances and to preserve the Egyptian Jordanian alliances because that's why those states have been so interested in this union. It's not because they just want Israeli technology or American dollars. They're terrified of Iran. And up until Joe Biden's presidency, the last 4 presidents have had something interesting in common, right? Which is all of them have tried to pivot away from the Middle East. I said 4, but it might be 3. My counting's not so good, right? George Bush II broke Iraq, and enabled Iran to rise the way it did because of the balance of power there, and then sort of said, I'm done with this. Obama said it's time to pivot to China and didn't want to deal with the Middle East in the same way. And Trump, despite the Abraham Accords, also said, look, he's an isolationist. He's America first. So everyone in the region got the signal. On all sides of the American political spectrum, people are pulling out of the Middle East, and Iran got the message too. And so I do think that Biden's reinvigorated sort of attention to the Saudi deal, which, by the way, I think has as much to do with China as it does to do with Iran, right? Like China has been inserting itself in the Middle East as in other regions. So we wanted to build a bulwark against Iran and its axis, but also against China. So that's a long answer to your short question, but I think it's a very good question, and I think that we can't take our eye off the ball that this is bigger than an Israeli-Palestinian conflict right now.
Thank you. I know that I read in the New York Times, probably within the last week and a half or 2 weeks, that Saudi Arabia had a meeting with that Iran sent their representative to, as well as other Arab countries. Just wondering what you think about that. That's pretty amazing that somebody from Iran went to Saudi Arabia.
Well, that rapprochement actually began before the current situation. Over the last year, there has been a slight warming in ties between Iran and the Saudis. And again, it's sort of above my pay grade to know exactly how to read that. But again, what I would conjecture, what I would guess, is that the Saudis were seeing the same thing that I just described. If the U.S. is not going to be here, right? If they're moving out of the region, then maybe we need to figure out some alternative strategies for existing here. Instead of endless enmity with Iran, maybe we need to try to foster rapprochement. But I don't know why that warming has happened.
I want to jump in and ask you one question, which is, I heard a sermon a couple of weeks ago by a colleague who said that we American Jews find ourselves in a very squeezed place right now. We're in this very kind of narrow spot. And I think... on the one hand, we really want to support the humanity of the Gazans, and we want to be, as we always have been, as a liberal Jewish community, champions of Palestinian rights to have dignity and live in security like we want to. And on the other hand, when we hear everywhere this slogan, from the river to the sea and all this business, it becomes very hard, as you mentioned, on college campuses and just anti-Semitism as it's been, or anti-Zionism in the form of anti-Semitism. What do we do here and in Israel? How can we live with this tension between this, vocal uprising of from the river to the sea, and yet at the same time we know that there's something that we have to support underneath that, even though that hideous genocidal slogan against the Israel and the Jewish homeland is intolerable to us. On the other hand, we want to be there and we want to support, but it pushes us away in a horrible way, as it must, a statement like that. What do we do? I mean, what do we do as American Jews who support NIF, who support the work there?
Look, I mean, I wish I had the easy answer for you. I can answer a lot about Israel and what's happening on the ground. I struggle with the same thing that you're struggling with. What I will say is that two things have guided my thinking over the last 5 weeks, and I try to balance them. But that's a good Jewish tradition, to have two seemingly mutually exclusive imperatives in each of your hands and balance them. And I think that that exercise is the answer for me. What I said to my girls and to their friends on campus who were so upset by everything, by the reaction and non-reaction to what happened to Israel, and then by the accusations that Israel's committing genocide, and then by the reality of people dying in massive numbers in Gaza, and their understanding, because they're my girls, that the situation is really complicated and no one is blameless, and Israel and the Palestinians and the Arabs and the West have all contributed to getting us where we are now. So I simplified it for myself and for them by saying, look, if you're talking to someone who is ignoring, rationalizing, justifying, or God forbid, celebrating or mocking the slaughter of innocent people, the horror and terror of innocent people, on one side and not the other, right? Then something is deeply, deeply broken with their moral compass. And don't be those people, right? We have, in my opinion, as human beings and Jews, and those of us who are liberals as liberals, to contend with that complexity and say, I am not going to rationalize, justify, ignore, or worse, the death of any innocent child. I'm going to do everything I can to put my shoulder to the wheel to stop the machinery of violence and war and death. And a lot of people don't like to say cycle of violence in the Middle East, but I'm not one of those people. It's a terrible cycle of violence, and it has to be ended. And so that's the first thing. And the other thing I keep in mind is, you'll like this one. Imen ani li mili ushcha le'atzmi ma'ani ve'im lo achshav ematai. Right? Rabbi Hillel, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, if I don't confront this problem now, then when? So I had a friend, a rabbi friend, who said to me today, he said, you sound really tired. and he said, you gotta take care of yourself. And I thought, oh yeah, imena nili mili. But I think it's true for this situation too. It's okay that we felt the pain that we felt. It's right that we felt the horror and the pain that we felt and feel, right? For Israelis and for many of us, it's still October 7th. And it's right and okay that we're feeling anguish and confusion and concern about what's happening now to millions of people in Gaza. And I don't think it's up to us to try. I don't think we even should try to resolve that. I think both of those things are profoundly human, profoundly Jewish things to feel, and I don't think we should put it off, because it's now, right? And so that means, what's the prescription? To avoid those two sides. To say I absolutely refuse to justify extremism on either side. I'm absolutely, however uncomfortable it may be, I'm going to throw myself into the work of trying to figure out how you stop the gears of this. An Israeli poet once called it the Haggadah machine, right? How do we stop this, and how do we? And here's where I think, at least at New Israel Fund, we feel like we have, for us anyway, and hopefully for many of you, Part of the answer to that is, so you support those Arabs and Jews who are standing together. You support those people on the ground in Israel. You know, when I show my kids videos from standing together, you know, and they juxtapose that to the social justice warriors screaming, you know, and there's a real live Palestinian woman and a real live Israeli Jewish man saying, we are not enemies, we refuse to be enemies, we will figure this out together. That's heady stuff, right? And when we say we're going to support those organizations that are today, even today, thinking about how do we get out of this, how do we get back to something that could result in a different horizon, however unrealistic everybody tells us it is, however impossible, like, it's not impossible, right? What's the Margaret Mead quote? The only, you know, don't despair about a small group of people trying to change the world. It's the only thing that ever does. So that's my only counsel and advice for us. Look for the good guys.
Next question.
Hi. You mentioned when, I guess, your disappointment in the allies of Jewish progressives not condemning the Hamas attack, calling them out, you know, saying that they weren't human rights guys. And I agree. What then, though, my question is, would you say about Yitzhak Shamir, the head of the Lehi gang? Menachem Begin, the head of the Organ.
Not human rights guys.
I know you know about them because I read about them in your book.
Yeah.
About Sharon and the crack Unit 101. Would you call all Yitzhak Rabin for commanding the marches, the forced marches from Ramla and Lot? Would you call these fellows not human rights guys either?
Yeah. So one of the I feel like maybe it's because we're in a shul that some of you know I dropped out of rabbinical school after a few months, and I feel like it's coming back to me tonight because this is the second like Jewish traditional thing I'm going to say. Like, I am a real believer in the idea of tshuva, right? That like people can turn and change their ways. So I wouldn't condemn any, you know, it's funny. I once, the angriest a group ever got at me in a shul was back when I ran an organization called Progressive Jewish Alliance in LA. It's now called Bend the Arc. And I was in a synagogue in Pasadena, and I said, I thought innocuously, people were saying like, but Arafat's a terrorist, and how can you trust him? And he's gone back. It was during the Second Intifada. And I said, well, you're right. But Menachem Begin was a terrorist, and so is Yitzhak Shamir. And I thought people would say, like, oh, that's a really good point. And they matured and changed, but they did not. They did not. And I learned a lesson about public speaking that day. But of course, you're right, right? And so the question isn't, I don't think anything is dispositive in a human being, and I hope that those people who are doing those things will learn and change, right? That's why I what do the Catholics say? It's beautiful. Hate the sinner, love the sinner, hate the sin. You know, and I, boy, this is like a very religious talk tonight. So for me, you know, like, I don't think those reactions were in line with the values of human rights, nor do I obviously think the actions of Shamir and Begin when they were terrorists, and Sharon, and they were terrorist friends. They ran organizations that targeted civilians to terrify and terrorize the population into doing what they wanted, right? Which in this case was getting rid of the British or terrifying Arabs to leave. But people change, and so my hope is that those people will change, and that through listening and conversation they'll change, and that's why no one asked me this question, and so I shouldn't even answer it because that's like the first rule of this stuff. Also, don't call people terrorists in Pasadena in 2002. But you know, I don't love the whole. As much as it pains me, and I hate seeing my daughter and my daughters and their friends and kids struggling with this stuff on campus, I didn't like the doxing of those kids at Harvard. I mean, to say that someone at 20 years old should be punished for the rest of their life because something that they said on college campus, that doesn't sit right with me. I don't think that's a human rights thing to do. So I'm a believer in tshuva, and my hope is that some of those people will listen and change. By the way, most of them are going to be working on Wall Street or at law firms in 3 years, and they won't believe they said this stuff. But my hope is that they will change.
So we have time for one last question. Then I want to turn it over to Orly to close for us.
So I wonder how your solution would look like. You call it a partition plan, and I think even the majority of Haaretz journalists now say that there's no way for a two-state solution now. So what would you like to see as the first steps to come closer to each other?
So, thank you for that question. The prevailing orthodoxy of the last 14 years, with the exception of the previous brief government, right? And even there, it was the prevailing orthodoxy of one of the two prime ministers. Naftali Bennett subscribed to what I'm about to say. Yair Lapid does not subscribe to this. But the prevailing orthodoxy is something that I borrow from 1973. And in Hebrew they say the conceptia, which, as you can tell, means the concept. And in 1973, the conceptia was shown to be completely wrong, a strategic dead end that resulted in the worst surprise attack in Israeli history. And there, the conceptia was the idea, it's too military detailed to get into, but basically the Israeli military and political echelons thought that absent certain kinds of weapons that the Egyptians didn't possess, they would never dare to make a Suez crossing. And obviously they were wrong, right? So this government and its predecessors have been animated by a new concepcia. And it goes like this. You can manage the relationship with Hamas, which really is more interested in governance than being part of some massive jihadi attack on Israel. What'd you say? Yeah, right. Mow the lawn, they would say sometimes. And Netanyahu bragged about it, right? He said, look, I allow support to go to Hamas because they're a counterbalance to the PA, and the PA ultimately supports a two-state solution. And if you don't want to see a Palestinian state, I will point out, still the official position of the state of Israel, if you don't want to see a Palestinian state, you have to support Hamas and you balance them. He was very proud of that. If there's any justice in the world, that will be his political death warrant that he just signed. So that was part one of the concepcia. And part two was, at the same time, you can pour new settlements and settlers into the West Bank, obviating any possibility for a two-state solution because there'll just be too many people. Now, at the time, 20 years ago, there were 100,000, or 30 years ago, 100,000 settlers. Today, there are almost 750,000 settlers in the West Bank and the unilaterally annexed expanded neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, which, by the way, used to be called the West Bank. So you got a lot more people, that's for sure, and they put them there. And the third part of the concepcia was you could do both of these things while making peace with the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. And that has been shown to be a strategic, and I would argue, moral dead end now. So the concepcia is gone. No one thinks the concepcia is possible anymore. So what's left, right? One path forward that I also think has been disproved as realistic for the time being, I never thought it was realistic these days, is what my friend Peter Beinart puts forward, which is a kind of a more utopian democratic single state for all people. It's a lovely idea. It's just that they don't want that in that place, right? And the rabbi is saying Lebanon, right? So. And by the way, that's my third fear. I talked about the specter that haunts me of a collapse of Israeli society with bands of Jews and Arabs killing each other on the streets. That's the road to Lebanon. So if the concepcia is no longer seen as viable, if the utopia isn't seen as viable, if Lebanon is not an acceptable answer, then what's left? And that's why I and many people come back to this notion of partition. And I use the word partition, as I said jokingly earlier, so that if I said two-state solution, people wouldn't say, oh, I've been told that's over. As I said, the biggest obstacle to a two-state solution is a lack of political will, not a lack of political imagination. And we are funding several efforts which are quite interesting. This is long before the 7th of October. Yossi Beilin, a former minister in the Rabin government, and some very high-level Palestinian and Israeli former peace negotiators have a project called Eretz L'Kulam, a land for all. And Eretz L'Kulam is a sort of a confederation model. Right? They would like to see, they don't think it's feasible to move 700,000 settlers out. They don't want anyone to have to leave. So they say, let's divide the country into two political entities, Palestinian and Israeli, in some kind of confederation, right? So there's kind of like a group that is dealing with some issues, and otherwise, no matter where you live, you can be governed by your own little government. There's also people working on a federated model, which would actually be more physical splits, right? The West Bank, Gaza, the Golan, Israel proper. So there are creative, thoughtful people trying to think about ways forward. There's an idea of cantons, like in Switzerland, right, where you have your own language, but there's a federated model above it. So I don't know if any of those are going to be the thing. I don't know if it's going to be what I think the rabbi and I, just because I can hear him murmuring here, both I think agree is more likely, which is some return to a two-state solution where still 80% of the settlers are within a few kilometers of the Green Line. The plan was always, there's just a lot more of them now. You annex that to Israel, you give a commensurate amount of land out of Israel to the new Palestinian entity. Obviously, the Rand Corporation down in Santa Monica did a brilliant study at the turn of the last century called the ARC, where they showed how you could build an infrastructure, transportation connection between Gaza and the West Bank. So there are lots of smart people who have spent lots of energy and time and who are ready to spend it again in thinking about this. I have the great privilege of having on my board right now Aaron David Miller, the former chief peace negotiator for the U.S. He came in after my previous board member, Martin Indyk, ambassador and former peace negotiator, termed out. So I've had the privilege of talking to these people and listening to what they say. And they say, like, the idea that it's impossible, that's as much of a fiction. Like, nothing is impossible. And so a return to something that we got close to 20 years ago, or something new that figures out new ways to keep people separate but together, right? That accepts that no one is leaving and that everyone has the right to equality and dignity and everyone has the right for self-determination. I don't think those are impossible things to find. I think what's the hard part is you have to find the leaders who are willing to take the risk to find them.
I would add, it's the strategy of the maximalists that want to say it's impossible on both sides. But what NIF does is get beyond the maximalists to what we can do.
Right. Well, before we leave tonight, I'll just say a few final words. First of all, a really huge thank you to the three of you for this incredible conversation. And thank you for welcoming us here at Emanu-El and to the staff that helped to set up the refreshments ahead of time. Several of my colleagues are around and helpers passing out some forms because we wanted to leave you with something that you can do. And I don't want to say anything more about that until I thank everyone who's already stepped up. At New Israel Fund, we have just been so heartened by the incredible response of supporters across the U.S., in parts of Europe, in Australia, in Israel, who have said, what can I do to help? And you heard a lot about the emergency work that NIF is doing. This is a little bit more information. If you've already supported that, thank you so much. Give it to someone else. Share it with someone else. I also just am so delighted to see people I know, and I want to say happy belated birthday to Rita Semmel, who I'm just so thrilled to get to see here tonight. It really is like being with family. Some of you I haven't seen in person in a few years, so thank you to all who are here. And if you don't know me, I'm Orly Bine. I'm the Senior Director for the New Israel Fund in the Bay Area. I do hope that, like for me, the New Israel Fund can be a place of hope and comfort and maybe grounding in this really difficult moment. I think it has for all of us on staff and so many others who I know are part of our leadership here tonight. This is a heartbreaking time, and yet there's just beautiful and inspiring work that we should take with us, and I hope you can take that home with you today and pass it around to others. And hold this in between difficult space and tension, even as we grapple and hope that there will be peace soon. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all again.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Erev Tov, and speaking for Rabbi Graf, we encourage you to come to shul tomorrow night at the shul of your choice.